Cops drew guns on my wife. Seconds later, she outranked them. It was supposed to be a normal Sunday morning, just me, sitting with my coffee, when suddenly, pounding on the front door shook the whole house. I peeked outside, and there they were, 3 sheriff deputies, hands on their weapons, eyes locked on me. Before I could even process it, their guns were raised, pointing straight at my chest. And just when I thought my life was over, my wife walked out. What happened next left everyone frozen and changed everything forever. Welcome back to HOA Max Stories, where real neighbors share unbelievable tales of life under homeowners associations. My name's Tom. I'm just a regular guy living in a quiet HOA neighborhood in Florida, and let me tell you, I've seen my share of drama with these folks. Now, before I take you through today's shocking story, I'd love for you to join our little community here. Go ahead and subscribe, it's free, it helps me keep telling stories like these, and honestly, it feels good knowing we're not alone in this HOA madness. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I bet some of you are sipping coffee in the same kind of neighborhood as me right now. When my wife stepped outside that morning, everything slowed down. The sunlight hit her uniform just right, that brown leather jacket with the gold star badge shining on her chest, and in that moment, I swear even the air went still. The deputies, who only seconds ago had their guns pointed straight at me, suddenly froze. Their mouths half open, their eyes wide like they'd just seen a ghost. I didn't move. I couldn't move. My heart was pounding so loud I thought they might hear it. And all I kept thinking was, this can't be happening over an HOA complaint. But there we were, 3 armed deputies in my front yard, my wife standing tall on the porch, and me caught right in the middle. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't flinch. She just looked at them calmly, steady as a rock. And then she said the words that would flip everything upside down. I'm the sheriff. The silence that followed was unreal. You could almost hear the breeze across the trees. One of the deputies slowly lowered his weapon, his face turning pale like all the blood had drained from it. Another one looked at his partner, like he wasn't sure if this was a joke. And me? I just stood there trying to breathe, because in that split second, all the fear I had turned into something else: confusion, anger, disbelief. How did it even come to this? Let me take you back a little bit. This wasn't the first time the HOA had tried something crazy. For years they had sent warning letters, fines, even little reminders taped to my door about the most ridiculous things. The trash can was visible for 10 minutes too long. The grass was half an inch higher than their so-called standard. My mailbox paint faded just slightly and they demanded I redo it. It was always something. But this time, it was different. That week, I had received a letter claiming that my property was a safety hazard. They didn't explain much, only that they had escalated the issue to the county. I thought it was nonsense. I laughed at it, even tossed it aside, because I couldn't imagine it meant anything serious. But now, staring at 3 guns, I realized the HOA had actually called law enforcement on me. Over what? My porch light bulb? A lawn chair? Or maybe just because I refused to bow down to their every silly rule? My wife had warned me before. They're going to push harder, she said. But even she didn't expect this. And here's the thing, my wife isn't just in uniform for show. She worked her way up, spent years proving herself in a world where people doubted her. And now, standing on our front porch with 3 deputies staring her down, it was like all of that history, all of that strength, was right there in her voice. Put your weapons down, she said again, calm but firm. The deputies hesitated, but slowly, one by one, they lowered their guns. I could feel my shoulders drop with relief, but at the same time, my anger started boiling. My HOA had taken this too far. They had turned my quiet Sunday morning into a near life or death situation. And as I looked at those deputies, embarrassed and shifting their weight, I thought, they had no idea they just walked into the wrong house. My wife crossed her arms, almost like a teacher scolding students. Now, she said, someone explain why you're here. The lead deputy stuttered, glanced at his partners, and finally spoke. Ma'am, we received a call from the Homeowners Association. They reported a dangerous situation at this residence. Dangerous situation? I almost laughed. What was dangerous here? The sound of my lawn mower? The shade of my paint? Or maybe the fact that I never gave in to their intimidation letters? My wife raised an eyebrow. Dangerous situation? In my house? The deputy cleared his throat, looked down at his shoes, and mumbled something about protocol. It was embarrassing for them. But it was also terrifying for me, because it showed just how far the HOA was willing to go. They weren't just sending letters anymore. They weren't just leaving warnings on the mailbox. Now, they were willing to use law enforcement as their personal weapon. And in that moment, I realized something even bigger. This wasn't just about me. How many other homeowners were going through the same thing? How many people, especially older folks in neighborhoods like mine, were living in fear because of these HOA boards that acted more like dictators than neighbors? I could see my wife's jaw tighten. She wasn't just standing there as my partner, she was standing there as a sheriff who had seen enough of this nonsense. She stepped closer to the lead deputy and asked, "Do you know who I am?" His voice cracked as he answered, "Why yes, ma'am." "Then you know," she continued, "that I don't appreciate false reports wasting county resources and pointing guns at my husband over a lawn complaint." The deputies didn't know where to look. They just shuffled awkwardly, muttered apologies, and backed away toward their cars. I stood frozen, still holding the doorknob, watching as the whole scene unraveled. And right then, I knew this was only the beginning. If the HOA could go this far once, what would they try next? The thought made my skin crawl. Now let me ask you something. If your HOA ever went as far as calling cops on you, and those cops ended up pointing guns at your chest, how would you react? Would you fight back, stay quiet, or pack up and leave the neighborhood altogether? Tell me in the comments, because I really want to know what you would do. After the deputies left that morning, my porch still felt heavy, like the air itself carried the weight of what had just happened. I closed the door slowly, my hands trembling. My wife, calm as ever, hung her jacket on the chair and poured herself a glass of water, as if she had just come home from any normal day at work. But I couldn't shake it off. My chest was tight, my thoughts racing. Cops had just pulled guns on me, in my own home, because of my HOA. I kept pacing the living room. I wanted to shout. I wanted to punch the wall. Instead, I just asked out loud, how far are they willing to go? My wife didn't answer right away. She just looked at me, her eyes sharp, then finally said, "They've crossed a line, and lines don't uncross themselves." That sentence stayed in my head. Because she was right. The HOA had always been petty, but this wasn't petty. This was dangerous. I sat down and thought about the history of it all. From the day we moved in, the HOA had made sure we knew who was in charge. They didn't welcome us with smiles. They welcomed us with rules. First, it was the mailbox. It must be painted the same shade as the others. Then, the trash can. It can't be visible from the street at any hour. Then, the fence. It's 2 inches taller than regulation. It never stopped. Letter after letter, fine after fine. At first, I tried to comply. I fixed the mailbox. I hid the trash cans. I trimmed the grass like they wanted. But the more I gave in, the more they wanted. Soon, it wasn't about the rules. It was about power. One board member, an older man named Clark, made it his mission to remind me who held the authority. He would stand at the edge of my lawn, arms crossed, staring at me while I worked outside. He'd point out every small thing like he was a king inspecting his land. And then came the letters signed with threats of further action. I didn't know what further action meant back then. But now, I had seen it. Guns in my face. I remember that night after the deputies left, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the stack of old HOA letters I had saved. Each one looked more ridiculous than the last, but together, they painted a picture of an organization that thought they were untouchable. My wife joined me, sitting across the table. She didn't look tired. She looked ready. "You can't let them bully you anymore," she said. "You stood quiet too long. They see that as weakness. I rubbed my forehead. But how do you fight an HOA? They control everything here. She leaned forward. They control nothing without fear. Take away the fear, and they're powerless. Her words lit something inside me. I started to think back to all the times neighbors whispered about being fined, about being embarrassed in meetings, about being too scared to speak out. Everyone hated the HOA, but nobody had the courage to stand up to them. Maybe that was why they hated me so much. Because I wasn't afraid to call them out. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw Clark standing at the end of the street, talking to another board member. He looked at me, smirked, and then shook his head like he had already won. And that smirk, oh, it burned me. I walked back inside and told my wife, I'm not letting them get away with this. She didn't stop me. She just said, then you better be ready, because they won't back down easy. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed thinking about everything. The knock at the door, the guns, the silence when my wife revealed who she was. I replayed it again and again, until my chest ached with the weight of it. By morning, I knew I had to act. But act how? That was the question. Do I file a complaint against the HOA? Do I call a lawyer? Do I rally the neighbors? Do I confront them face to face? Each choice had consequences. And I knew whatever I did, they would come back harder. I stood at my front window, looking out at the calm street, the trimmed hedges, the neatly painted homes, and all I saw was control. An illusion of peace, built on fear and fines. I thought about my neighbors, the elderly couple across the street who once told me they got fined $50 for leaving a Christmas wreath up too long. The single mom down the block who cried at a meeting after the HOA threatened to tow her car for parking in her own driveway. Everyone had a story. But no one had dared to tell it out loud. Maybe it was time someone did. I turned to my wife and said, if they wanted a fight, they just found one. She looked at me with that same calm face she always had. Then be smart about it. Don't fight them on their level. Make them show the world who they really are. Her words echoed in my mind all day. I didn't just want revenge. I wanted the truth out. As the sun went down that evening, I sat on the porch, staring at the same spot where the deputies had stood with their guns raised. The memory was still fresh, and the anger was still sharp. But beneath it, there was something stronger now, determination. I wasn't going to let the HOA bury me in fear. I was going to dig them out instead. And as I sat there, I couldn't help but wonder, how many of you out there have faced the same kind of HOA madness? Have you ever been pushed so far that you thought, enough is enough? Tell me in the comments, because I'm starting to think I'm not alone in this battle. The next morning, I woke up with the same thought burning in my mind. I couldn't let the HOA win. But as soon as I walked outside, the sound of a car door slamming caught my attention. It was Clark again. He stood across the street, arms crossed, whispering to another board member. They didn't even try to hide the way they watched me. It was like they wanted me to feel the pressure, like they wanted me to know they were still in control. And for a moment, I felt that old anger bubble up again. The memory of those guns pointed at me was still raw. My chest tightened, and I could almost hear the officers' voices shouting, "Hands up!" I had to take a deep breath just to keep my hands steady. But then, my wife stepped onto the porch behind me. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Just having her there reminded me that I wasn't alone, that the HOA didn't scare her, and they shouldn't scare me either. That's when I decided. I wasn't going to wait for the next attack. I walked back inside, grabbed the stack of HOA letters I had saved, and laid them all out on the kitchen table. One by one, I read through them. The wording, the tone, the threats, it was all the same. Cold. Controlling. Designed to make me feel small. But I noticed something else too. In their rush to intimidate me, they had slipped up more than once. Dates didn't match. Rules were quoted that didn't even exist. Fines were doubled without explanation. And the more I read, the more I realized they weren't just bullies. They were sloppy bullies. That gave me an idea. I called up a neighbor I trusted, Mr. Reynolds, an older man who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. He answered in a low voice, like he was afraid someone might overhear. When I told him what happened with the deputies, there was silence on the line. And then he said something I'll never forget. "You're not the first one they've done this to." That stopped me cold. "What do you mean?" I asked. He sighed, and his voice cracked a little. "A few years back, they sent officers to another neighbor's house, claimed his backyard shed was a safety risk. The man was in his 70s. They scared him so bad, he sold his home within a month. Moved out. Never came back." I clenched my fist so tight the phone almost slipped. So it wasn't just me. They had a history of using fear to force people out. I thanked Mr. Reynolds and promised him I'd talk more later. When I hung up, I looked at my wife. Her face said it all, this was bigger than us now. That evening, I decided to attend the monthly HOA meeting. They held it in the community clubhouse, and usually only a handful of people showed up. But when I walked in, I felt every pair of eyes on me. Clark sat at the front, smiling like he already knew I'd be there. He tapped his papers on the table and cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, we need to address the recent incident at Mr. Thomas's residence." I froze. My stomach knotted. They were going to spin the story. Clark leaned forward, pretending to look concerned. "We received multiple complaints that Mr. Thomas's property posed a danger to our community. We had no choice but to involve law enforcement." The room murmured. Some nodded. Others looked uneasy. I stood up. My voice was steady, even though my heart was racing. "Dangerous? My home? You sent deputies with guns over what, a lawn chair? A porch light? Tell the truth, Clark. You wanted to scare me. Just like you scared the Johnsons years ago." The room went silent. Clark's smile faded. He shot me a look that could cut glass. "Sit down," he snapped. But I didn't. "You can't keep hiding behind letters and fines. You've turned this neighborhood into a place where people are afraid to breathe. You've crossed a line, and everyone here knows it." I looked around the room. People shifted in their seats, some whispering to each other. For the first time, I saw cracks in their silence. Clark slammed his hand on the table. "You are out of order." I almost laughed. Out of order? After what they had done to me? After pointing guns at my chest? I leaned closer. "No, Clark. You're out of order." The tension was thick. My voice echoed in the small clubhouse. My hands shook, but not from fear anymore. From adrenaline. Clark tried to move on to the next agenda item, but the meeting never recovered. The board looked rattled, and the neighbors looked curious, like maybe, just maybe, they weren't as powerless as they thought. When the meeting ended, a few neighbors came up to me quietly. They whispered things like, "Good for you," and "It's about time someone said it." But they also looked nervous, glancing over their shoulders as they spoke. Walking home that night, I realized I had lit a spark. And sparks can either start a fire or burn out. It all depended on what I did next. As I closed my front door, my wife asked softly, "Are you ready for what comes after this?" And I didn't know the answer. Because standing up to an HOA in public wasn't just bold, it was dangerous. So let me ask you, if you were sitting in that clubhouse, watching your neighbors stand up to the entire board, would you have joined in? Or would you have stayed quiet, hoping not to be their next target? Tell me in the comments, because I wonder how many of you would have spoken up that night. When I got back home that night after the meeting, the house felt different. The air was heavier, like the walls themselves knew something had shifted. I sat on the couch in silence, still replaying every moment. Clark's face when I stood up. The neighbors whispering behind their hands. The board losing control for the first time in years. But along with that memory came another feeling, a warning. I knew Clark. I knew the HOA. They wouldn't just let it go. My wife walked into the room, holding 2 mugs of coffee even though it was late. She handed me one, sat across from me, and said in that steady voice of hers, "You made enemies tonight." I nodded. "They'll come back harder, won't they?" She didn't answer right away. She just took a sip, then finally said, "Yes. They will." I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "Then what do we do?" Her eyes narrowed. "We stay ready." The next morning, I stepped outside to grab the newspaper, and right there on my lawn was a fresh letter from the HOA. No envelope, no stamp. Just a folded piece of paper shoved under a rock. I picked it up with shaky hands and unfolded it. The words were short, sharp, and ugly. "Keep talking, and you'll regret it." No signature. No explanation. I stood there in the driveway, the sun just starting to rise, and for the first time I realized, this wasn't just about fines or meetings anymore. This was personal. My wife read the letter and her jaw clenched. "They're trying to scare you into silence." But the thing is, it worked for a few minutes. I paced the kitchen with the note in my hand, fear creeping back into me. I thought about the deputies, the guns, the way they shouted at me to put my hands up. I thought about the neighbors who whispered but didn't dare speak loud. And then I thought about Clark, standing in his neatly pressed polo shirt, acting like he owned the whole street. The fear started to melt, replaced with anger again. "They want to fight?" I muttered under my breath. "They'll get one." Later that day, I decided to walk the neighborhood. I stopped at Reynolds' house first. He opened the door slowly, his eyes darting like someone might be watching. When I showed him the note, he shook his head. That's how they work. Quiet threats. Scare tactics. They count on people folding before it ever gets public. I asked him, "Why doesn't anyone speak up?" He sighed. "Because people here are older. They don't want trouble. They just want peace in their retirement years. They think silence keeps them safe." I stared at him, frustrated. But silence is why Clark gets away with it. Reynolds looked down, his voice soft. "You're right. But not everyone has a sheriff living in their house." That stung, because it was true. Without my wife, I might have been just another neighbor too scared to say anything. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I sat on the porch again. And sure enough, Clark walked by. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just stared at me as he passed. His eyes said everything. It wasn't over. That night, I woke to a noise outside. A dull thud, then another. I pulled back the curtain and froze. Someone had thrown eggs at my garage door. Yellow yolk dripped down the white paint in thick streaks. I stepped outside with a flashlight, scanning the yard. But whoever did it was gone. My wife joined me, arms crossed, her voice calm but sharp. "They're testing you. They want to see if you'll break." I clenched my jaw. Not this time. The next morning, I didn't clean the garage right away. I left the mess there for the whole neighborhood to see. And sure enough, as people drove by on their way to work, they slowed down. They saw it. They whispered. By noon, Clark was back at my door. This time without the board, without papers. Just him. He didn't knock. He didn't smile. He just stood on my porch and said, "Clean it up. You're making the neighborhood look bad." I stared at him, my hands balled into fists at my sides. "I didn't put it there." He smirked. "Doesn't matter. People will think you did." My wife stepped up beside me. Her badge wasn't showing, but the authority in her voice was just as strong. "If you know who did it, Clark, maybe you should be more worried about vandalism than about how clean my door looks." For a moment, Clark's face faltered. He wasn't expecting her to speak. He wasn't expecting resistance at all. He cleared his throat, muttered something about standards, and walked away. That night, as I scrubbed the egg stains off my garage, I realized something important. This wasn't just about rules. It wasn't about lawns, or mailboxes, or fences. It was about control. The HOA wanted to decide who could stand tall and who had to bow down. But I wasn't bowing anymore. The more they pushed, the more determined I became to push back. I sat with my wife afterward, my hands raw from scrubbing, and I said, if they want to play dirty, maybe it's time I show everyone just how dirty they really are. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. Just be careful. When people in power feel threatened, that's when they get desperate. And I knew she was right. Because deep down, I could already feel it. Clark wasn't done. The HOA wasn't done. They had tried guns. They had tried threats. They had tried vandalism. And I had a gut feeling the worst was yet to come. So let me ask you something, if you were in my shoes, standing on that porch with neighbors watching and the board breathing down your neck, would you fight them head on, or would you take the quieter road and protect yourself? Tell me in the comments, because I really wonder how many of you would risk everything just to stand your ground. That night, after Clark walked away from my porch, I sat there in the dark for a long time. The street was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful, it feels like a warning. Every small sound, a dog barking in the distance, a car door shutting blocks away, made me jump. I kept thinking about the look in Clark's eyes before he left. It wasn't just anger. It was a promise. And promises like his never meant anything good. My wife finally came outside and sat next to me. She didn't say a word. She just placed her hand over mine, firm, steady, grounding me in that moment. But even with her calm presence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. The next morning proved me right. I opened my mailbox, and inside wasn't a bill, wasn't a flyer, it was another letter. This one typed, bold letters across the top, notice of violation. According to the HOA, my front porch created an unsafe environment for the neighborhood. Unsafe? My porch? I laughed out loud in disbelief. There was nothing on it but 2 chairs and a small table. But right there in black and white, the letter threatened me with a fine of $500 if I didn't correct the violation within 7 days. I carried the letter back into the house, slapped it down on the kitchen table, and looked at my wife. Unsafe environment, can you believe this? She picked it up, scanned it, and then shook her head. They're baiting you. They want to drown you in nonsense until you break. I felt the heat rise in my chest. Well, I'm not breaking. Not this time. And that was the moment I decided, if they wanted a war of papers, I'd give them one. I spent the next several hours pulling every single letter I had ever received from the HOA out of my files. I laid them all across the dining room table, years of warnings, fines, threats. My wife watched me quietly as I sorted them by date, highlighting every inconsistency, every made-up rule, every time they had stepped out of bounds. It was like building a case. And the more I stacked those papers, the more I realized I had one. But deep down, I also knew something else, the HOA didn't play fair. They wouldn't just sit back while I exposed them. And sure enough, that evening, I got a taste of their next move. I was sitting in the living room when headlights swept across my window. A car slowed down outside, then stopped in front of my house. I pulled back the curtain just slightly and saw a dark sedan idling there. It didn't move. Minutes passed. My wife came over, peered out beside me, and whispered, "That's no coincidence." Finally, after what felt like forever, the car rolled away slowly. But I knew it wasn't over. They were watching me now. The next day, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, just to clear my head. As I walked past the clubhouse, I noticed Clark standing with 2 other board members. They stopped talking the moment they saw me. Clark smirked, then raised his voice loud enough for me to hear. "Some people just don't belong in this community," he said. The others chuckled. I clenched my fists, but I kept walking. By the time I got back home, though, the anger was eating me alive. I turned to my wife and said, "They think they can isolate me. Make me the villain." She shook her head. "Then you need to remind them you're not alone." That's when it clicked. It wasn't just my fight. It was every neighbor who'd been bullied, fined, or humiliated into silence. So that evening, I started knocking on doors. At first, people were hesitant to talk. They looked nervous, glancing around like someone might be watching. But when I told them what happened with the deputies, their eyes widened. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered stories of their own: fines for kids' bicycles left outside, threats over holiday decorations, warnings for tiny cracks in driveways. It was endless. And as I listened, I saw something change in their faces. For the first time, they realized they weren't alone either. By the time I made it back home, I had half a dozen neighbors telling me the same thing: if you stand up, we'll stand with you. That night, sitting at the dining room table surrounded by all those letters and notes from my neighbors, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. But with hope came fear too. Because if Clark found out I was rallying people, his retaliation would be brutal. I turned to my wife and asked, "Am I making a mistake? Am I putting us in danger?" She looked straight at me, her voice firm but gentle. The mistake would be letting them win. Her words hit me deep. And right then, I knew there was no turning back. The HOA had used their papers, their threats, even law enforcement against me. Now it was my turn to fight back, not with fear, not with silence, but with truth. Still, as I sat there late into the night, one thought kept circling in my head: how far would Clark go to protect his power? So let me ask you, if you were building this case, knowing your neighbors were starting to trust you but also knowing your HOA leader was watching your every move, would you push forward, or would you back down before things got even uglier? Tell me in the comments, because I can't stop wondering how many of you would take that risk. That night, I sat in the living room staring at the piles of papers spread across my table. Every letter, every threat, every complaint, all of it told the same story. The HOA wasn't protecting the neighborhood. They were controlling it. The more I looked at those papers, the more my anger burned. But along with the anger came something else, a fire in my chest that told me I couldn't keep this inside anymore. My neighbors had whispered their stories to me. They trusted me with their pain. Now it was time to make sure everyone saw it. The next morning, I made copies of every single letter. I stapled them into packets and slid them into folders. Then, one by one, I delivered them to the neighbors who had promised to stand with me. When Reynolds opened his folder, he shook his head and muttered, "They've been lying to all of us." Another neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, stared at the papers with trembling hands. They fined me for weeds, and they didn't even fine Clark when his fence broke down. It was favoritism all along. Everywhere I went, I saw the same reaction. Shock, anger, realization. The HOA had built their kingdom on silence, but now the silence was breaking. That evening, a group of us gathered quietly in my backyard. 6 families, all tired of living under Clark's thumb. We didn't raise our voices, we didn't wave our fists. We just shared stories. And for the first time in years, people laughed again. Laughed at the absurdity of it all. Laughed at how ridiculous some of the HOA's rules were. But under the laughter, there was something else: unity. And that's when I knew we had power. My wife stood with us, arms crossed, her eyes scanning the street like a guard. When the meeting ended, she pulled me aside and whispered, "You realize what this means now, don't you? Clark won't just push back. He'll go to war." I nodded, my jaw tight. Let him. He doesn't scare me anymore. But the truth was, part of me was scared. Because Clark wasn't the type to lose quietly. And sure enough, 2 days later, he showed his hand. I walked outside to find a giant red notice taped to my front door. Mandatory hearing, HOA violations. They had scheduled a meeting where my behavior and property issues would be formally addressed. It was their way of putting me on trial. When I showed the notice to my wife, she didn't even flinch. Good. Let them put you on trial. You'll put them on display. Her confidence gave me strength. The night of the hearing, the clubhouse was packed. More people than I had ever seen at a meeting before. Word had spread. People wanted to see what would happen. Clark sat at the front of the room, his tie a little too tight, his smile a little too smug. He tapped the gavel on the table. This meeting is called to order. We are here to address the repeated violations and disruptive behavior of homeowner Thomas. My stomach turned, but I stood tall. I carried the thick folder of letters in my hand, and I wasn't alone. Reynolds, Mrs. Jenkins, and several others were there too, seated in the crowd, watching closely. Clark began to read a list of so-called violations. Trash cans left out, lawn overgrowth, porch clutter, disruptive conduct at meetings. Every word made my blood boil. And finally, when he paused for breath, I stepped forward. "Funny," I said, my voice steady. "Because I have letters here that say something else." I opened the folder, pulled out the papers, and held them high for the room to see. "Here are your so-called rules, changed, twisted, and applied whenever you feel like it. Here are fines doubled without reason. Here are threats mailed at midnight. Here are examples of Clark letting his friends slide while punishing everyone else." The room went silent. Clark's face turned red. "That's enough," he shouted. But I wasn't done. "No, Clark. It's not enough. Because these people deserve to know the truth. They deserve to know that the HOA isn't about safety or order. It's about control. And you've been using fear to hold on to it." Gasps filled the room. Neighbors looked at each other, whispering, shaking their heads. Some glared at Clark. Others nodded at me. And for the first time, I saw the board members themselves shift uncomfortably in their seats. They weren't used to being called out. Clark banged the gavel again, his voice trembling. "Order!" I said order. But there was no order. The room had come alive. People started raising their voices, asking questions, demanding answers. One man shouted, "Why was I fined for my mailbox when Clark's was broken for months?" A woman stood up, holding her own letter. "Why did you threaten to tow my car when others parked the same way and nothing happened?" The board tried to hush them, but the noise only grew louder. In the chaos, my wife stood up. She didn't raise her badge, didn't flash authority. She simply said, "This community deserves better than leaders who abuse their power. If the HOA wants respect, it has to earn it." Her voice cut through the room like a blade. Everyone fell silent for a moment, letting her words sink in. Clark looked like he might explode. His face was red, sweat beading on his forehead. But he couldn't stop what was happening. The fear was gone. Walking out of that clubhouse, I felt lighter. For the first time, the HOA wasn't untouchable. They had been exposed. And the neighbors had seen it with their own eyes. But deep down, I knew Clark wasn't finished. He'd never give up power without a fight. And as I locked my front door that night, one thought chilled me to the bone: what would he try next, now that fear no longer worked? So let me ask you, if you stood up in front of your entire neighborhood and called out the leaders for abusing their power, knowing they wouldn't stop until you were silenced, would you keep pushing, or would you walk away while you still could? Tell me in the comments, because I wonder how many of you would take the fight all the way. When I got home after that explosive hearing, I sat in silence for a long time. The night outside was calm, but inside my chest, my heart was still racing. I could still hear the echoes of voices in the clubhouse, neighbors shouting, Clark slamming his gavel, my wife's calm words cutting through the noise. For the first time in years, the board had lost control. And everyone had seen it. But I knew Clark too well. He wasn't the type to admit defeat. He wasn't the type to walk away. Sure enough, the very next morning, I woke up to find another notice taped to my door. This one was bigger, bolder, printed in red ink. Final warning, property in violation. They were doubling down. I ripped it off the door and laughed. It wasn't even anger anymore, it was pure disbelief. They're really not giving up, are they? I muttered. My wife took the paper from my hands, glanced at it, and said flatly, "This is desperation. They're losing their grip." And she was right. Because later that day, something remarkable happened. One by one, my neighbors started showing up at my house. Mr. Reynolds was first, then Mrs. Jenkins, then two families I had barely spoken to before. They came carrying their own notices, their own warnings, their own stories. They were tired of hiding. We sat in my living room, papers piled high on the coffee table, voices overlapping as people poured out years of frustration. Some cried. Some shouted. But for the first time, nobody stayed quiet. It wasn't just me against the HOA anymore. It was all of us. That evening, we decided to draft a petition. We wanted Clark and his allies removed from the board. We wanted a new election. And we wanted rules that actually protected the community instead of terrorizing it. As we passed the paper around, signing our names, I felt something shift deep inside me. The fear that had once choked us was gone. Replaced by courage. By unity. But courage has a way of drawing fire. The very next day, Clark showed up again. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 board members flanked him, and behind them stood a man I didn't recognize, tall, sharp suit, carrying a briefcase. Clark smirked when I opened the door. "This is our attorney. You're being served." The man handed me a thick envelope. Inside was a lawsuit. According to the papers, I was guilty of defamation, harassment, and disruption of community order. It was their final weapon, the law. For a moment, I felt that old weight again. My hands shook as I flipped through the pages. They wanted to drag me into court, bleed me dry, bury me in legal fees until I disappeared. But when I looked up, I saw my wife standing tall behind me. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She just said, "Good. Now it's all out in the open." That night, I barely slept. I kept wondering if I had pushed too far. If I had put my family in danger. If maybe silence would have been safer after all. But the next morning, when I stepped outside, I saw something that gave me hope again. My neighbors. Dozens of them. Standing on my lawn, holding signs, holding copies of their own letters, their own fines, their own stories. They weren't afraid anymore. One by one, they spoke out. They told me they'd testify. They told me they'd stand by me in court. They told me they were done living under Clark's shadow. And for the first time, Clark looked nervous. When the case finally went before a judge, it didn't take long. The stack of letters, the testimonies, the inconsistencies, it all came crashing down on the HOA. The judge dismissed their claims, and instead, questioned their conduct. The board was ordered to hold new elections. Clark and his allies were stripped of power. When the ruling came down, I felt a weight lift from my chest so heavy, I didn't even realize how long I had been carrying it. Walking out of that courthouse, neighbors patted me on the back. Some hugged me. Mrs. Jenkins cried tears of relief. Even Reynolds, who had once been too scared to speak above a whisper, said loudly, "We're free of them." That night, for the first time in years, the neighborhood was quiet, and it finally felt like peace. I sat on the porch with my wife, the same porch they once called an unsafe environment. The same porch where deputies once pointed guns at me. And I thought about everything we had been through. From fear, to anger, to unity, to freedom. It was a battle I never wanted, but one I'll never forget. And as I looked around at the houses lit softly under the night sky, I realized something important. HOAs are supposed to build communities, but too often, they destroy them. And the only thing that keeps bullies in power is silence. But silence is no longer an option. So let me ask you, if your HOA pushed you this far, if they fined you, threatened you, humiliated you, even dragged you into court, would you have the courage to stand up and fight back, or would you walk away and let them win? Tell me in the comments, because I want to know how many of you would rise up when it matters most.